So it's pretty interesting, the keynote and how it was focused a lot on security. And I want to talk about a couple of things that we're working on within engineering that deals with security as well. So next slide, please. So first of all is an IRR update. And what I like to do is talk to you about some of the things that are somewhat surprising and some of it, yeah, makes sense. So the first part is what makes sense. So when we turned off IRR in terms of putting out new maintainers or so on for ARIN non-authenticated IRR, we did that back in June when we rolled out the new authenticated IRR, or what's called ARIN now, and the non-authenticated portion is called ARIN non-auth. The authenticated portion is in the green line here, and so in the ARIN part is in orange. And you can see that the number of maintainers in ARIN has increased a lot, and this is not surprising. Next slide, please. What's interesting here is you can see on the route objects that there's a close matching on the number of routes that have been added on both the non-auth and the auth side. They've both increased by about 4,000 over this last quarter, last half of the year, rather. Next slide, please. And you can see that with Route 6 objects, there is some increase on the number of Route 6 objects in the ARIN authenticated IRR, and a nominal increase on the non-authenticated portion. So next slide, please. So we expected to see a drop in ARIN non-auth, but that's not really reality. Maintainers who are part of the old legacy IRR have come to life. They are now registering objects and the non-authenticated portion of the IRR. And the number of objects added is roughly the same in both the authenticated side as well as the non-authenticated side. And of course, we see growth in the number of orgs participating in the ARIN IRR. One of the things that I saw as sort of a question is, did we expect to see a significant drop in ARIN non-auth? I did, but that doesn't seem to be reality. So anyways, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of update on the IRR. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about RPKI. Next slide, please. We had two challenges over the past 6 months. We've had two software updates, which led to some interesting issues. First one was an encoding issue that was seen by a subset of validators. When we tested against it initially for our August release, we tested against RIPE's validator as well as NLnet Labs Routenator, and they both passed our tests, and the manifest came out green. But when we deployed, it turns out that there was a number of other validators that said that we had issues, and we were notified of this and had it quickly fixed. So at that point, we have increased the number of validators that we test against, and we put it on the web page, on our web page under our the RPKI section on the validators that we do support. And we support NLnet Labs Routenator, RIPE's validator for a certain period of time. They have announced that it will no longer be supported by RIPE with the upcoming maintenance and that release, and that's about it. There's Fort and there's RPKI Client. Those are the ones that we currently test against. We do have a observer platform that we run ourselves, and we check these things against their outputs, the various validators outputs, to make sure that the number of validated route objects that come out of it are actually the same between all the various validators. And we also included Octo RPKI in that test to make sure that we have a consistent and uniform output. So that was one of the first lessons learned that we learned over this past year. The second one is that we had a little issue where we admitted the number of delegated RPKI users in a software update. So after that, we did an audit of our implementation against the RPKI RFCs, and our test coverage to make sure that we're totally covering all of the particular elements, what's manual and what's automated. And we also hired a senior product manager, Brad Gorman, to help lead this activity. So those are things that we've done as a result. And so those are issues that we are sincerely sorry about. And we are trying to do our best to make sure that we're up 100% of the time, all the time. Okay, next slide, please. One of the interesting things here is if you look off to the right, you'll see that we've had, that we keep on having growth in a number of organizations, number of rows, number of resources. And what's interesting here is we've had a jump, and this jump is fairly recent, where we went from 9 to 16 delegated RPKI participants. So I think that's interesting. Most of the participants are still 1,776 are still using our hosted service, but you can see that the number of delegated customers is increasing. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's happened, which is interesting, is we look at this on almost a daily basis to make sure that we're doing all the things correctly in RPKI land. And one of the things that we noticed, and hopefully you can see this, is that we are now have the most number of ROAs out there in the community. RIPE has been working on this for a long time. They have lots and lots of people actually using RPKI as well as we do, but we've actually surpassed them in a number of validated ROAs that are out there in the wild. So I thought that was interesting that we now have a significant portion of RPKI that's being managed by ARIN. Next slide, please. So here's an interesting thing. Much like the keynote, we're occasionally under attack, and we've noticed some things. I want to bring this to your attention. Next slide, please. We've had an instance where there was actually a number of instances where we've noticed a flurry of brute force hacking attempts against people's accounts. And when we initially set this up, our account login behavior was we did 6 login attempts, and then we would lock your account. What this did is with this brute force hacking attempt, if they figured out your account name, they would actually keep on testing passwords until they got locked out. This led to a number of locked accounts, which was not a good thing to do. So we actually pivoted and inserted a CAPTCHA within the login process. So if you had, for example, 4 login attempts, it would then issue a CAPTCHA. And if you pass that CAPTCHA, then it would allow you to have a couple more login attempts before it would actually lock. And this basically stopped the brute force activity. So that was a good sort of stopgap temporary measure that we put into place, and it actually was very successful. Next slide, please. And here you can see something that we see internally. We look at this at least once a week, where we look at sort of normal behavior and making sure that our systems are operating correctly and that we see sort of standard sort of activity against our system. And you can see for the most part, it's pretty consistent. We have about 5.5 accounts, logins per minute. And at this point, it was currently 8 when we took the snapshot. But you can see that here's how we currently look at our systems. Next slide, please. Here's what it looks like, whoops, when you can see that we're under attack. And you can see that we had a small one where we, instead of having essentially 5.5 account logins per minute, here you can see that we had over 5,000 over a sustained period of time. And a little bit later on the 13th and into the 14th, we actually went up to 15,000 queries per second, a number of logins per second, where people are trying to actually try to guess people's passwords. And you can see that most of them were unsuccessful. Next slide, please. After this attack, one of the things that we did is we said, okay, let's look at this and see the number of invalid password. And you can see that we had close to 10,000 attempts. Most of these were blocked. They're by almost 250,000 attempts. and invalid usernames. All these people were trying to guess what the username was, and there was close to 11 million invalid users that they actually hit beforehand. Next slide, please. We were not the only ones that were under attack. We have a private mailing list that we use between the various engineering activities within the various regional registries. And we talked about this, and this actually made news within the RIPE NCC, as well as that they were also under attack by basically the same actors as what we saw. Next slide, please. So the resultant activity beyond the CAPTCHA that we put it in is that there was a consultation on login security. And there's a number of things that we have are going to do as a result. One is that we're going to align ourselves with NIST SP 800-63B get password guidelines. We're going to check, as part of those guidelines, we're going to check against a list of known values that are to be compromised so that you don't inadvertently put in a password that has been compromised someplace else on the internet. We're not going to impose any composition rules requiring, for example, requiring mixtures of various character types or prohibiting consecutively repeated characters. That is not part of the guidelines. And we're also going to start rate limiting by using a CAPTCHA and incrementing timeout periods between further attempts. So if you have a couple of attempts, and then we'll just increase the timeout value by doubling it or tripling it or whatever, so that it would take increasingly long periods of time for someone to actually guess the password, and they would have to use the CAPTCHA, and this would basically make this particular attack not very fruitful for the attackers. And again, this is according to the NIST guidelines. This code will be released in June of 2021. Next slide, please. So at that point, I am done. Are there any questions?
Yes, Mark, we have a question from David Huberman with ICANN. He says, Mark, can you please talk a little bit about ARIN's participation in RPKI protocol development at IETF, current status, and any goals that ARIN might have for improvements? Thank you.
Yes, so we have participated in IETF for years and years and years. And there's been various suggestions that we put in as part of our input within the Cyber Ops Working Group, which is where this RPKI work actually goes on right now. And we've done a number of things within this the past couple of years. One of the things that we put in, for example, was a draft that dealt with how we handle trust anchors. And we put in a draft that wasn't accepted by the working group, but it was something sort of indicating what we were planning to do with the various RIRs as we went forward, and that all of us would have basically say we would have all resources within our trust anchors for a couple of reasons. One is to essentially mitigate the amount of brittleness that does occur in RPKI, especially in deals with RIR transfers. So that is one of the things that we wanted to alleviate. And this is something that we went forward. There's some protocol development going on within IETF to make the RPKI validation less brittle, of which we're playing a part of as well. There's some other things going on as well as within the IETF that we're well abreast with, and making sure that we implement when the standards are ready. Thank you very much. Good question. Next question.
Yes, we have a question from Kevin Bloomberg with The Wire. What is the percentage of users that are now utilizing MFA? Has a hard requirement been investigated? Brute force attacks are common.
Yes, I think he meant 2FA, two-factor authentication. Is that correct, Kevin? I presume
MFA
it is.
multi-factor. He might mean 2, 3.
Okay.
Name, text, fingerprint, retina ID, and then you have to sing a song.
Okay. Well, you don't want to hear me sing, so obviously. So we do have existing 2FA implementation out there right now. There's also an ACSP to put in yet another form using YubiKeys, et cetera. So we have some varied sort of degrees in that we want to go forward with. 2FA is out there. Sadly, it's not as well used as we would like. And that is available now for those people who want to safeguard their passwords and everything else, their accounts. Please do so. Please use the existing 2FA application that's out there.
Mark, if I could add something there.
Yes.
So one of the things that has come up is some organizations have said they'd like to use two-factor authentication, but they note that it's turned on a per user basis. And so what we've looked at, and it did come out in the consultation responses, we'll be looking at a feature that allows an organization to set mandatory two-factor authentication for all of its assigned users. And that way, if it's your policy that you want everyone to use two-factor authentication, the accounts associated with you will have to have it turned on. We're not going to do that automatically because each organization has its own decision as to what's appropriate for its ARIN online accounts. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, John.
All right, our next question comes from Rob Seastrom with Capital One Cyber. ARIN AC, have you decided on a minimum length? NIST SP 800-63B says more is better, but has a suggested bare minimum length that seems short. Related, will there be a maximum length? i.e., if I want a 70-character long passphrase, is that okay?
That is a good question. I will have to get back to you, Rob, on this question in terms of what our maximum length is within our application. So that's a good question. I will get back to you.
Okay, that is all of the questions.
Any other questions for Mark? If not, thank you, Mark. Very helpful.
Welcome. Thank you.